And yeah, so thanks, Henrik. This was super interesting and insightful about the tree mortality caused by climate change from a physiological point of view, and in particular that you emphasized the important role of carbon reserves. I will now present parts of my own current work in forest management modeling, which happens to deal with carbon reserves, and I show a potential way how to model carbon reserves as a first stop toward modeling tree mortality more realistically. And since this is all work in progress, please don't think about particular details and numbers in this talk, take it more as a conceptual overview. So as we all know, and as Henrik mentioned, climate change comes with the increase of frequency and severity of weather extremes and exposes forests to stress. We can see here in this picture the ultimate consequence in the mid-range mountains in Germany. And I think since high latitude regions are warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet, such a scenario is not unrealistic for the future of Swedish forests either, in very near future, maybe even. So what can be done in terms of forest management, and hence even previously in terms of forest management modeling, to prevent such a catastrophe and to keep forest productivity up? This figure shows how now and in the past in Swedish forests, growth is larger than total loss, where total loss is the sum of harvest and natural die-off. And this difference between the blue and the orange line, the difference between growth and total loss, can be seen as a carbon sink. And now let's have a look at the die-off rates in Germany. And here, this is what Henrik also mentioned, we can see that after the year 2017, this die-off rates totally exploded, not only for spruce, but also for pines and for deciduous trees. And this explosion is due to warmer and drier conditions. So now let's make a bold thought experiment and transport this increasing die-off rates to Sweden. Will then in the future, the Swedish forests still remain a carbon sink? I think that currently forest management for Sweden are fine with ignoring tree mortality, as natural die-off rates, as shown here in green, are pretty low. But as can be seen at the example of Germany, this might not be the case anymore in the future. So future forest management models need to take tree mortality into account somehow. And connecting to Henrik's ideas, one way to do this is to model tree resilience via carbon storage, also called carbon reserves or non-structural carbohydrates. Please note that when I'm talking about non-structural carbohydrates, I'm always referring to the carbon component, so only to the carbon which is inside such of non-structural carbohydrates. How can we conceptualize this non-structural carbohydrates in a model? Well, when a tree creates structural biomass, some carbon will be lost as growth respiration, but also at the same time, some carbon will be stored as non-structural carbohydrates. And as the tree grows, structural biomass increases, but at the same time, non-structural carbon reserves increases. And then in the case of a stress event, the tree can resort to its non-structural carbohydrate reserves and survive for a while. But with ongoing depletion of these reserves, the tree's resilience decreases and decreases, and at some point it will just die. Many forest management models are purely statistical models based on forest inventory data. Here, for example, we see schematically one part of a typical statistical forest management model by Pukala from 2020. And in general, forest inventories do not take non-structural carbohydrates into account, because I think they are in general also very intricate to measure. Consequently, such purely statistical models are incapable of modeling carbon storage, and we need some different approach here. The approach could be a process-based model. So here we see a schema of what a process-based forest management model could look like. And What I'm talking about, my models are always carbon only. So carbon enters the forest vegetation by being photosynthetically fixed from the atmosphere. So it enters the trees of the forest, and these trees are represented by a number of typical mean trees, where each mean tree actually represents a certain number of identical trees in the forest. And mean trees, so different mean trees can differ, for instance, in species or in age or in size or in tree density. From these trees, carbon is then released back to the atmosphere by maintenance and growth respiration. And also carbon moves to the soil as litter. Furthermore, there might be harvesting events at some point. And depending on the size and the species of the mean tree, some parts of the tree move either to the soil or to the wood product pools. In this presentation, I won't bother much with the soil or wood products pool. I am now continuing only with modeling a single mean tree. And let's start with a very simple model. So carbon is fixed by the tree by photosynthesis and is temporarily stored in a transient pool. And from this transient pool, carbon is allocated to the tree organs, such as leaves, the fine roots, the stem, and coarse root and branches. This model is actually way too simple to model carbon reserves. So let's make it more complicated by splitting up the leaf component into two pools. One pool is the leaf structural biomass, and the other pool is leaf's non-structural carbohydrates. And look at the arrows going to the green leaves components. We see that only from the non-structural carbohydrates, carbon can also return to the transient pool. And only from this transient pool, carbon can be respired to the atmosphere. This means respired carbon for maintenance and growth must always come from such labile storage, non-structural carbohydrate pools. While what we have done now to leaves, we can do the same thing to the fine roots. So we split up the fine roots component into a fine root structural biomass pool and a fine roots non-structural carbohydrates pool, exactly the same way as with the leaves. And then we're doing the same thing with stem and coarse roots and branches. Here actually there is one difference, and this difference is that coarse roots and branches and stem, they share one single non-structural carbohydrate pool, and this pool is generally thought to be associated with wood. And furthermore, we introduced for stem and for coarse roots and branches sapwood pools and hardwood pools. So once we have this structure, we are basically, by structure of the model, very close to the allometrically constrained growth and carbon allocation model, in short ACGCA, that was introduced by Oakley and Pakala in 2009. Also, Herrera et al. In 2020, they used a similar model in a non-structural carbohydrate modeling experiment, to which we will come later. Why is this model actually called allometrically constrained? Well, in my particular model case, this is because statistical models such as the one before that we have seen by Pakala, such statistical models provide external allometric constraints to the process of carbon allocation to the tree organs. Now have a look here at the red arrows and only at the arrows going out of the transient pool. In this model, in the ACGCA model, it is supposed that with each gram of carbon that goes into structural biomass, a certain amount of carbon also goes into the storage pools. So this is what Henrik mentioned earlier. He said that usually many models just do this storage allocation to storage as a kind of an overflow if something is left over. But the ACGCA model actually actively puts carbon into the storage. But a major physiological question is how much carbon is actually put into the storage. I think Henrik mentioned already quite a lot of that. So this is a research field in its own. because this carbon allocation to storage is supposed to be highly dynamic and might depend on all kinds of things, such as tree species, tree state of health, other dynamic tree variables such as age and diameter, on dynamic diameter and dynamic environmental factors such as available resources, or even the competitive situation with other trees and plants and animals might play a role. The ACGCA approach is rather simple because it is semi-dynamic. For leaves, for example, we assume a fixed ratio of leaf storage over leaf structural biomass, and the same for roots, for fine roots. We assume a fixed ratio of fine root storage over fine root structural biomass. The dynamic part comes with the wood. So there is assumed to be a dynamic ratio of newly allocated wood storage over newly produced wood. And this dynamic ratio depends on the current wood density, on the maximum storage capacity of living sapwood cells, on the xylem conducting area to sapwood area ratio, and the inverse density of sapwood structural tissue. So we can see that even though this ACGCA approach is rather simple and only semi-dynamic, it already introduces a bunch of new parameters. And each of those new parameters is actually pretty difficult to determine. Nevertheless, I think modeling non-structural carbohydrates with some well-guessed parameters is still way more realistic than ignoring non-structural carbohydrates completely. And furthermore, this can be considered as a major step towards modeling a realistic path of a carbon atom through the tree from the very moment when it is fixed by photosynthesis until it is released from the tree by respiration, lithophore, or by harvesting. Let's for a moment step back from this one tree perspective and have a look at a tree stand. Here we can see the schematic time evolution of the size of the storage pools during a forest management simulation over 160 years. We are having here 3 different management strategies, each starting with a clear cut, but then representing the forest by a different number of mean trees and applying different harvesting strategies. Don't worry too much about the exact shapes of the graphs, but just notice that different management strategies actually have a huge effect on the amount of carbon stored or labile carbon stored in the trees and in the forest. And hence different management strategies have a huge impact on the tree and forest resilience. The problem is now, if we're having such simulations, how do we know if these simulations are any realistic? And I'm now going to propose 2 ways how to relate non-structural carbohydrate modeling to actual measurement data coming from experiments with the real trees. And the first of these 2 approaches deals with the concepts of age and transit time. An advantage of process-based models over purely statistical models is that we can even think of such concepts like age and transit time of carbon in the first place. Our model, the ACGCA adapted version, represents a typical mean tree, which is everything inside this green area here. And this means that the atmosphere is outside of the model, but it provides the tree with inputs. So the first step is that a carbon atom enters the model or the tree by photosynthesis, which is represented by this green arrow. Then from the transient pool, this carbon atom is allocated to one of the tree organs, which is shown by the golden and red arrows. And at some point, the carbon atom leaves the tree either by respiration, which is the blue arrow, or by senescence or harvesting, which is represented by this grayish arrows. Note that these red connections between the transient pool and the non-structural carbohydrate pools are actually the only connections where carbon can be recycled. So the storage pools have a substantial influence on the age of carbon in the tree. Speaking of age, what actually is the age of carbon in the tree? As far as I know, Bolin and Rode were the first ones to conceptualize age and transit time of let's say carbon or any other kind of amount in ecological systems. And they came up with the ideas that age is the time that has passed since a carbon atom entered the system. In our case, the time that has passed since the carbon atom has been fixed by photosynthesis. And transit time is the age of carbon at the moment of its exit from the system. This means we can also think of transit time as the time span between the carbon atom entering the tree and leaving the tree. Both age and transit time in this way are defined for a single carbon atom. This means that if we are looking at a whole bunch of a huge amount of carbon atoms, we get some age and transit time distributions. Let's try to get a first grasp on age and transit time distributions. Imagine we are having a simple model where our tree is modeled by one single pool. We can describe this model by a single ordinary differential equation, which is shown here. And carbon leaves the tree at a fixed rate r. And leaving the tree means it's either respired to the atmosphere or later fall towards the soil or is cut off and goes to the wood products. Here we can see the equilibrium age density of the carbon in such a one pool tree, where the actual rate of carbon release from the tree is 0.5 per year. This 0.5 per year means that the mean age of carbon in the tree is 2 years, as is indicated here by this vertical dashed blue line. We see that actually there is much pretty young carbon in the tree and very little old carbon. And here in this one pool setting, this density that we see here is actually just a classical exponential distribution, as we would also see it for radioactive decay. We can now, for example, make the system slower. So we reduce the release rate R from 0.5 per year to 0.2 per year. And we see that the mean age increases. So this is now the orange graph, and the entire system moves to older ages. So the slower the system, the older the things in this tree actually are. An important point for this one pool system is that age and transit time are actually identical. Recall that the transit time is the age of carbon at the moment of exit. And in a one pool system, everything has to exit from the same pool. So necessarily age and transit time must be the same in a one pool system. Now let's think about a system with more pools than only one. Imagine we're replacing our tree model, which was just one pool, now by our version of this ACGCA tree. This model has 10 pools. And we have to describe our model now not only by one ordinary differential equation, but a system of 10 ordinary differential equations. And we can either write it in this messy way, where we note all the single components, or we just use the matrix and vector notation of below. Now let's have a look at the age and transit time in such an ACGCA tree model. Here, the upper graph shows the age of carbon in the tree, and the lower graph shows the age of carbon leaving the tree, so the transit time. And we can immediately recognize that those two are not the same anymore. And the reason for this is that different pools have different age distributions, as we can see here on the right. The upper plot on the right shows the age distribution of the carbon reserves. This still looks a little bit exponential, but actually it's not. And the lower plot shows the age of carbon in the trunk hardwood pool, and this has a completely different shape. The reason for this is that carbon, before it can reach the trunk hardwood, it needs to travel through other pools first. And this means that in this trunk hardwood pool, there cannot be any carbon with age 0. The take-home message from the last two slides is that in a one pool system, age and transit time are the same. But in multiple pool systems, age and transit time in general differ. And from my personal experience in all process-based carbon models for soils, vegetation, or the terrestrial biosphere, the transit time is usually much lower than the age, indicating that most of the fixed carbon is released pretty early, and only a little amount of the fixed carbon stays in the system for a longer time. Now let's come to the previously mentioned modeling experiment by Herrera Ramirez in 2020. Imagine we're having such an ACGCA tree in some kind of equilibrium, and we're running a simulation. And after 10 years of simulation, we cut off the carbon inputs from photosynthesis. This can be done, for example, by girdling, or how did Henrik mention, by defoliation. So this basically is the modeling version of such a girdling experiment. We see that for the first 10 years, the mean age of respired carbon is pretty young, but once the tree is cut off its external inputs, it has to use older and older and older carbon for its metabolism, for growth respiration, or for maintenance respiration. And as we have seen, the only possibility for carbon to be respired is that this carbon comes from the carbon storage, from the non-structural carbohydrate reserves. Honestly, with this simulation, there are at least two problems. The first problem is that in this simulation here, it is assumed that even though the tree has no external inputs anymore, it acts as if it were still in equilibrium. So it doesn't change its carbon allocation scheme or carbon recycling scheme or anything. It just acts as if external inputs were still available. And I think that a real tree would certainly adapt its strategy somehow. The second problem is, now looking at this, how do we know whether this is realistic or not? There is one thing I also want to mention. Henrik has also mentioned this. So we can see that the age of respired carbon increases and increases. But what we cannot see here is, Henrik mentioned it and also showed it, that at the same time, the pure amount of respired carbon goes totally down. And at some point, there is just nothing more available to respire, and the tree will die. Can we now know whether this simulation is somehow realistic? There are two ways we're seeing here this mean age of the respiration. So one approach is to compare this mean age of the respired carbon with results from labeling experiments at girdled trees. Or another approach is going through the radiocarbon. Suppose we can describe our tree model by a system of ordinary differential equations. Here, the first equation. Then with a very simple mathematical adaptation, we can also model the radiocarbon component of this model. Here in the lower formula, the lambda is just the radiocarbon decay rate. Decay rate ID is the identity matrix, and 14I T is the adapted inputs of radiocarbon. And these adapted inputs are a mix of the inputs I of T of the original model and the radiocarbon bump curve. So the radiocarbon amount in the atmosphere that Henrik showed before. So this means having a nice equation system, ordinary differential equation system for the original model, we can also easily simulate the radiocarbon component. And then we can directly compare the radiocarbon model respiration with radiocarbon field measurements in girdling experiments. This way, we can then assess the model predictions and maybe even through the backdoor somehow calibrate the model and try to improve this difficult part of the storage allocation. So what was this all about? So let's recap. So at first we noticed that climate change comes with increasing die-off rates of trees. And consequently, tree mortality needs to be modeled in forest management in the future, even with delayed effects. And one way to do so is to model resilience via carbon storage. And this can be achieved by process-based models. The quality of carbon storage modeling can then be assessed by comparing either the mean age of respired carbon to measurements from tree girdling experiments, or even by modeling the radiocarbon component directly. And well, this all can be seen as some conceptual first steps toward including tree mortality and delayed effects in forest management models. And it's basically a summary of my ideas on that topic. And I hope you at least got some broad overview of my trains of thoughts on that topic. And I thank you very much.